And so it has gotten to a point where the whiteness of Jesus has become more important than the God essence of Jesus in the flesh. And the psychology was, you take our religion and here is our God. This white man right here. Hello, I'm Dr. Theron Williams. I am the president of the Bible is Black History Institute, and I am the author of the Bible is Black History series and the pastor of the Mount Carmel Church of Indianapolis, Indiana. And I'd like to welcome you to the Bible is Black History Institute. And I want to talk with you for a few minutes about the color of Christ. And I know that the color of Christ shouldn't be an issue, but it is. Especially when the color of Christ has become so politicized that there are those who have embraced the white depiction of Jesus, and that his whiteness has become more important than his divine essence. And when you elevate his whiteness above the divine essence, then we have a problem. We don't know what Jesus looked like historically. For all we know, Jesus never sat and posed for an artistic rendering. And if he did, that rendering is lost in antiquity. So we don't know what the historical Jesus actually looked like. We know that iconography of Jesus began to emerge after the 3rd century AD. Those are the earliest depictions that we have of Jesus. And the early church iconography, Jesus iconography, was not designed to capture an accurate historical depiction of Jesus. Rather, the early iconography of Jesus was more to make a theological statement than it was to capture the historical likeness of Jesus. And the historical images of Jesus by the early church around the 3rd century BC and earlier, those AD and earlier, those images were mainly to address at least 3 issues that confronted the early church. Number one, the early depictions of Jesus was a refutation of a dangerous doctrine that floated around the early church world called Docetism. And Docetism advances the notion that God was Jesus on earth. But since God is so holy, since God is so pure, that God is too pure and too holy to come in contact with something as evil, wicked, and debased as human flesh. So the Docetists said that God did come in the person of Jesus Christ, but Jesus Christ was not human. He was 100% spirit, but he projected a human appearance, but he himself was not human. He was totally spirit. That's Docetism. And we see, particularly in the Gospel according to John, some pushback against that doctrine of Docetism in the prologue of the Gospel according to John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. So John is saying, yeah, God did become flesh. And John said, and we saw him. So that was a pushback against Docetism. And so the early iconography of Jesus made the theological statement that this image represents a Jesus of flesh and blood. Because you can't capture an image, you can't capture a spirit on canvas. You can't paint a phantom or a ghost on canvas, only a human being. So the early depictions of Jesus were making a theological statement that Jesus was not just spirit, but he was also flesh. Another function of the early iconography of Jesus was a reaffirmation, not just for a refutation of Docetism, but it was also reaffirmation for the early church community that there was a man in the first century from Nazareth named Jesus. This is the subject of our faith. This is the God of our religion. And this is the God whom we worship. And since there were no one around in the third century to have been with Jesus to give a description to the early church of what Jesus looked like, they invented their own images, not to capture accurately the historical likeness of Jesus, but to remind themselves or to reaffirm themselves that there is a person in Jewish antiquity, first century Palestine, who grew up in Nazareth of Galilee, who died on Calvary and was resurrected, a human being named Jesus. So they captured their own imaginations of what they believe Jesus looked like, not so much going after an accurate depiction, but for reaffirmation that a man named Jesus lived. And so they captured it on canvas. So it was not just for refutation or for reaffirmation, but it was also a reflection. That is, the early church community invented images of Jesus that captured and reflected the ethnic characteristics of that particular Christian community. So in those icons of Jesus in the early church, it embodied the ethnic physical characteristics of that particular Christian community. So those were at least three reasons for the development of the images of Jesus. And as we see this particular image, this was around the 3rd century AD. And as you can see, the image of Jesus here is very dark, which is what most of the images, you see his skin tone is dark, like most of the images of Jesus of the early church. But as the centuries rolled on, Jesus' skin became lighter and lighter in their depictions. And when we get to the Renaissance period, Jesus has turned white. Not for any nefarious or evil reasons, but just like the early church invented depictions of Jesus that reflected the ethnic likeness of that worshiping community, the Europeans did the same thing. Their depictions of Jesus were basically a reflection of the Renaissance period church community. In other words, they made a Jesus that looks like them, the way other early Christian communities had done. But what was different about this in the Renaissance period, the great masters of the Renaissance sort of cemented that image of Jesus and were responsible for causing it to go viral because the great masters endorsed it. And one of the great masters was Leonardo da Vinci. And Leonardo da Vinci was a famous artist during the Renaissance period. And Leonardo gave us one of the famous icons of Jesus, the Salvator Mundi. And this is the image that the great Leonardo da Vinci, the great mind of the Renaissance period. And that painting now is worth over $1 billion, the Salvator Mundi. But Leonardo also gave us, among other things, the Last Supper. And that's one of his famous depictions of Jesus and the disciples. And we are all aware of the image of the Last Supper. And we see Jesus here, and we see his characteristics. And there's a story about how Leonardo da Vinci came up with the image of Jesus, with his rendition of Jesus, and how that was influenced. There was a man in his day named Cesare Borgia. Cesare Borgia was the son of the Pope, and he was the general of the papal army, the papal military. And Cesare Borgia hired Leonardo da Vinci to be his chief military strategist and his engineer. Alexander Dumas, the biographer of the Borgia family, argued that Cesare Borgia and Leonardo da Vinci, their egos were so huge that they just couldn't get along. You know, I mean, their egos were so big that they couldn't even be in the same room at the same time. You know, only one ego that big per room. So they parted ways. But Leonardo da Vinci was so impressed with the appearance of Cesare Borgia that Alexander Dumas said that it influenced his depictions of Jesus. And we see this image of Cesare Borgia. And when I first saw that depiction, I thought it was a depiction of the traditional Jesus. You know, I thought they had dressed Jesus up, because you do know that there are some people out there who are saying that Jesus was actually rich, a millionaire. And I thought that somebody took an image of traditional white Jesus and dressed him up to look like a millionaire. You know, I mean, look at that hat. Look at that fabric that he has. I mean, that's expensive stuff. You can look at it and tell. And then I started researching. I said, no, this is not Jesus. Jesus was a poor first century peasant living under colonial oppression in first century Palestine. They didn't dress like that. And so I found out that it was Cesare Borgia. Now, just with the eye test, there might be some credence to Alexander Dumas's claim that this image of Cesare Borgia influenced Leonardo da Vinci's depiction of Jesus. The other great master of the Renaissance was Michelangelo. And Michelangelo did do some paintings of Jesus, but his most famous depictions were sculptures. And we see this sculpture of Jesus holding on to the cross. That's a Michelangelo piece. And then we also see this image of Jesus laying in the arms of his mother, Mary, a dead Jesus. And that was a depiction or a sculpture done by Michelangelo. And when we look at the work of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, particularly those depictions of Jesus, they look alike. It is as if they've been cut from the same template. And even though their work was infused with politics, if you study the great masters, you study their work, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, they just weren't painting pictures and carving sculptures, but they were speaking through their work, politically charged, sometimes challenging the theologies of the early church. But one of the things, even though their work was politically charged, and even though they spoke through their work, one of the things they were not doing was creating these images to advance the notion of white supremacy. They were not doing that. I mean, this whole question of race did not become a thing until the transatlantic slave trade. Prior to that, there was no such thing as race. Isabel Wilkerson, in her book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, she argues that the whole question of race, white supremacy, and racism, these are uniquely American inventions. So they didn't even exist. There was no such thing as white people or black people. In Europe, they identified themselves not based on the color of their skin, but from their national origin. They were Scandinavian, or they were British, or they were Italian, or wherever they came from. Never called themselves white, identified themselves based upon their national origins. African didn't call themselves black. They identified with their national origin or their tribal affiliations. They were Ethiopians, or they were Egyptian, or they were Nigerians, or they were Kenyans, wherever they came from. No black, no white. That black-white thing started, according to Isabel Wilkerson, in the United States. So race really is a social construct. And that construct began to take shape during the transatlantic slave trade, when the Europeans came over to North America and South America for the purpose of colonizing these distant lands, taking it over, dominating. And they came over with their Christian religion. And their Christian religion was anything but biblically based. You know, they created their own Christianity that had little or no roots in the Bible. But their religion was rooted and grounded in supremacy, giving themselves a basis upon which to build white supremacy, to dominate people who were not like them. And so they came over to the North America and South America. They called it the New World, but it wasn't new to the people who were already living on the continent of North and South America. It was new to the Europeans. So they came over with their religion and with their images of Jesus in tow. And they came over to, quote unquote, Christianize these savages by forcing on them this bastardized version of Christianity along with their white Jesus. And the psychology was, you take our religion and here is our God. This white man right here. Here is our God. And that's your God. And that's the Savior of the world. He died and was resurrected again, and you have to believe him. And not only do you have to believe him, you have to believe what we say about him. Because you can see the commonality. He's white, we're white. And the Word was made flesh and dwelled among us. And the God of heaven and earth decided to come to earth. But when he decided to come to earth, he could have chose any flesh to come in. So he chose white flesh. So that makes us the privileged class. So you have to listen to us. And you have to do what we say do, because we are his representatives. And so they are using this whole question of white Jesus not so much to embrace the essence of God, but to advance whiteness as superior. And so it has gotten to a point where the whiteness of Jesus has become more important than the God essence of Jesus in the flesh. And that has become a problem. And so Christianity, particularly from the far right wing, is actually built on this whole notion of white Jesus. When they talk about he died, that's who they're talking about, white Jesus. Rose again, white Jesus did that. A white man did that. Ascended to heaven, a white man did that. So the innocuous beginnings of white Jesus, as made popular by the Renaissance masters have become corrupted by this whole effort to advance the notion of white supremacy. And so the image of white Jesus has become one of the pillars of white supremacy. And I agree with Sean King. Sean King said that these images of white Jesus are oppressive and they need to come down. And I agree with the brother 100%. And if Christianity is anything, Christianity is supposed to be a religious faith that embraces truth. Because the founder of the religious movement called Christianity said, I am the way, the truth, and the light. Jesus talked constantly about the truth. He said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And the truth is, we know Jesus was not a white man. Yet, Western Christianity cleave to this white Jesus. We know he didn't look like that. We don't know exactly what Jesus looked like, but we know he didn't look like that. No more did he look like this. And the reason we know he didn't look like this is because Jesus was not a Chinese. The reason we know he didn't look like, we don't know what he looked like, but we know he didn't look like this. And the reason we know he didn't look like this is because Jesus was not Japanese. We don't know for sure what the man looked like, but we do know he didn't look like this. And the reason we know is because Jesus was not an Indian. He was not of Indian ancestry. Well, if we can deduce that Jesus didn't look like these three, why is it so difficult for us to deduce that Jesus didn't look like a European? He was no more of a European descent as an Indian or Japanese or Chinese. Neither was he of European descent. So we can write the other three off without even thinking hard about it. But when it comes to writing off the European rendition of Jesus, now we want to think about it. Because that image has been so ingrained into the world's consciousness that many of us are just convinced beyond the shadow of a doubt that that's the image of Jesus, the true image of Jesus. Megyn Kelly said, a matter of factly, well, everybody knows that Jesus is white. No, everybody doesn't know that Jesus is white because Jesus is not white. A man that is born in North Africa in the first century could never look like that. You know, so we hold on to this image of white Jesus. The church does. I mean, and even in some of our churches, we have depictions up of white Jesus in our stained glass windows. White Jesus in our home. White Jesus. He's ubiquitous. He's everywhere. Around the world. He's everywhere. This picture here is the salmon head. And it was invented by a man named Warner Salmon in 1940. If his appearance doesn't matter, why was this duplicated over 500 million times in the 20th century alone? We're in the 21st century now. They stopped counting. We're in the 21st century now. And that doesn't include the other variations of the salmon head. In movies and in print and on the cover of magazines, this image has influenced the image of Jesus and its acceptance in community, in society, more than any other. There is no other image that has been duplicated more than the salmon head. No other image. And that's religious, secular, whatever. No other image has been duplicated more than the salmon head. Why do you think that's so? If his image doesn't matter, why has this image been replicated so many times, just in the 20th century alone. You know, because the Christianity that many of us have embraced, it's propped up, it's built on this white guy. That's why it's so acceptable to so many people, because it's built on the image of a white guy. If Christianity would have begun with the knowledge that Jesus was a black man, like Buddhism, we know what Buddha looks like. You know, we know what he looks like. We got statues of Buddha. If we had statues of Jesus earlier on, and he was a black man, do you think Christianity would have proliferated in the West the way it has? I think not. I think not. I think what boosts Christianity and caused it to blow up is these images of white Jesus. Western Christianity is built on these images. He healed the sick, raised the dead, fed the hungry, dealt with his enemies, died on the cross, rose again, and he's coming back again. And when we talk about that in Western Christianity, we're thinking about this white guy here. That's what makes it so acceptable. That's what makes it so believable to so many people, because it's built on this white guy. And his whiteness is what's important. Not the God essence so much, but his whiteness. And Christianity is built on truth. And whenever we reproduce this image, we are reproducing a lie. Why is it so important for us to hold on to this lie when we know it's a lie? What makes this image so enduring? How come it won't go away when everyone knows he didn't look like that? Why is it still here? Because what's more important than anything is the whiteness of Jesus. And as long as there is a United States of America and Europe and European countries, that image is not going anywhere. It's here, and it's here to stay. Yet you have people who are saying that, you know, it really doesn't matter to me. I don't care if he's black or white or orange or purple or polka dot. I hear that so many times, you wouldn't believe it. It doesn't matter. He died for us, and he's the Lord. He's the Son of God. You know, I had a guy to say that to me. I was delivering a lecture, and it was to a mixed crowd dealing with the color of Christ. And I have a Q&A at the end of each lecture, and he rose and he said, well, it doesn't matter. You're being divisive. You're bringing up this color, and it really doesn't matter. I don't care what color he was. He died on the cross for me. He's my Savior. And I said to him, that sounds altruistic, but let me ask you some questions. I said, are you married? He said, yes. I said, is your wife white like you? He said, yes. I said, so you have children? He said, yes. I said, how old? He said, 14, 10, and 7. I said, okay, are they in church? Very active in the youth ministry of our church. I said, let me ask you about your church. Is your church multiracial, multicultural? He said, well, no, it's basically white. We have a few people of color who attend our church, but it's basically white. The pastor is white. The leadership team is white. The official board is white. It's basically white, but we do have black and brown people who attend our church. I said, okay, that's fine. I said, let me ask you this, and I want you to be honest. I said, if I were to give you this image and say to you, if you were willing to put this image on your wall at your house and take your 14-year-old, 10-year-old, and 7-year-old in front of that image and say to them, this is God in the flesh. This is Jesus. He healed the sick. He raised the dead. He opened the eyes of the blind. He fed the hungry. He died on the cross for all of our sins. His blood cleansed all of us from our sins. God raised him on the third day, and he ascended back to heaven, and he's coming back to get us. And we have to live up to his approval. If you want to go to heaven to be with him from now on, you have to live to please him. What do you think your children would say? Would you be able to do that? Would you be able to take this image of Jesus to your official board at your church and have them to plaster the walls of your church with this image? What do you think would happen? In your white church, but you have an image of black Jesus. How do you think that'll work out for your church or for your family? You know, he never did give me an answer, but I did give the brother something to think about. Because when you look at it in those terms, it becomes crystal clear that his color does matter.
What do you think about this topic? Remember to be a Berean scholar, as it is written in the book of Acts 17 verses 11 to 12. Now the Bereans were more noble-minded than the Thessalonians, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if these teachings were true. It's time to deepen your understanding and see your reflection within the sacred pages. Please click subscribe, and click the notification bell to stay up to date with the Berean Scholar channel.